The sonar sweep was supposed to be routine. A research vessel mapping the seafloor off the coast of Denmark picked up a shadow. It was resting in 134 feet of water, perfectly preserved by the cold Baltic Sea. When the cameras descended and the lights cut through the murk, the crew went silent. There, on the bottom, was a German U-boat that had been missing for over 80 years. The conning tower still bore the Nazi insignia. The hull was intact, but it was what they found when they finally breached the pressure door that changed everything. Inside that tomb of steel was evidence of an experiment so disturbing that even the Nazi high command had tried to erase it from history. The crew did not just vanish, they were used. And the technology they were testing could have changed the outcome of the war if it had worked. The ghost in the Baltic. For decades, fishermen in the waters between Denmark and Germany told stories about sonar ghosts. Their instruments would ping something massive on the sea floor, but when they returned to the same coordinates, nothing was there. Local legends whispered about cursed wrecks, submarines filled with gold or experimental weapons, ships that the ocean refused to give up. Most dismissed these as old sailor tales, the kind of superstition that grows in the fog. But in 2022, a team from the University of Kiel were not looking for legends. They were mapping unexploded ordnance from World War II, trying to locate dumped munitions before they corroded and leaked into the ecosystem. Their side-scan sonar was state-of-the-art, capable of painting a picture of the bottom with remarkable clarity. On the third day of the survey, the operator noticed an anomaly. It was not a barrel or a mine. It was long, cylindrical, and far too symmetrical to be geological. The image resolution was good enough to see rivets. The team pulled up the archival records, cross-referencing the shape and location with known losses. The dimensions matched a Type 7C U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet. Over 700 of them were built, and many were sunk or scuttled at the end of the war. But this one was not on any casualty list. There was no record of a submarine going down in this exact location. That alone was strange. The German Navy kept meticulous logs. Even in the chaos of 1945, when the Reich was collapsing, they documented their losses. A missing submarine implied something deliberate, something classified. The decision was made to send down a remotely operated vehicle. When the remotely operated vehicle's cameras powered on and the halogen lights pierced the darkness, the team saw her clearly for the first time. The hull was covered in a thin layer of silt, but underneath the paint was still visible. The identification numbers had been ground off, deliberately. Someone had taken the time to erase this boat's identity before it went into the water. The conning tower hatch was sealed. The deck gun was still in place. There were no visible signs of battle damage, no torpedo impacts, no shell holes. She had not been sunk in combat. She had been put here, carefully and quietly. The Norwegian researchers who reviewed the footage flagged something even more disturbing. The submarine was sitting upright on the bottom. Her ballast tanks flooded evenly. This was not a chaotic sinking. This was a controlled descent. Someone had opened the vents, let the water in, and rowed her down. The question was not how she sank. The question was why. And that answer was waiting inside, behind a steel door that had not been opened since the spring of 1945. The archives that did not exist. While the remotely operated vehicle circled the wreck, historians started digging. If this boat had no identification and no official record, maybe there were clues in the shadow files, the documents that never made it into the mainstream war records. A researcher named Peter Larson found the first thread in a British intelligence archive. It was a decrypted Enigma message from April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. The message referenced a special transport designated only as Unterseeboot Project Nacht, which in English is Submarine Project Night. The destination was listed as Sonderkommando Nord, a special command unit operating out of occupied Norway. But here is the catch. There was no record of what the project was or what the submarine was carrying. The message ended with a single line: all documentation to be destroyed upon receipt. Larson Cross referenced this with interrogation transcripts from captured German officers. One name kept appearing: Kapitänleutnant Ernst Richter. He had been the commander of a research detachment, not a combat unit. After the war, Richter was briefly held by the Allies, then released without trial. His file contained almost nothing. No detailed debriefs, no technical assessments, just a note that said subject provided no intelligence of value. That was a red flag. The Allies did not let submarine commanders walk away without squeezing them for every scrap of information, unless they had been told to let him go. Unless someone higher up wanted the whole thing buried. Larson found a single photograph in a Swedish archive. It showed a group of men standing on a dock in Kiel in early 1945. The faces were grainy, but one man in the center was clearly an officer. The caption identified him as Richter. Behind him, partially visible, was the conning tower of a submarine. The hull number had been painted over just like the wreck in the Baltic. The pieces were starting to fit. This was not a standard combat mission. This was a black project, something so secret that even the records of its existence were erased. The submarine found off Denmark was not just a casualty of war. She was a vault, and vaults are built to protect something. The decision was made. They had to go inside. But what the team did not realize was that opening that hatch would confirm a theory so dark that even 80 years later it would force us to rewrite what we thought we knew about the final days of the Third Reich. The horror was not that the crew had died. The horror was what they had volunteered to become, the door that should never open. Breaching a sunken submarine is not a simple task. The pressure differential, the corrosion, the risk of structural collapse, all of it makes the operation incredibly dangerous. But the team had the tools. They used a remotely operated cutting torch, carefully slicing through the dogs that held the conning tower hatch in place. The metal resisted at first, fused by decades of oxidation, but eventually the seal gave way. When the hatch finally swung open, a plume of trapped air bubbled out. Air that had been sealed inside since 1945. The remotely operated vehicle, the ROV, maneuvered into the opening, its cameras sweeping the interior. The control room was eerily intact. The periscope was still raised. The depth gauges were frozen at 40 meters. The lighting panels were dark, but the layout was clear. This was a standard Type 7 configuration, at first. As the remotely operated vehicle, called the ROV, moved deeper into the boat, past the cramped officers' quarters and toward the aft sections, the standard layout ended. Where there should have been crew bunks and storage, there was something else. A sealed bulkhead. It was reinforced, far thicker than the normal watertight doors, and it was locked from the inside. The camera focused on the door. There were markings stenciled in German. Zutritt verboten. Nur autorisiertes Personal. Entry forbidden. Authorized personnel only. Below that, a symbol, a black eagle clutching a swastika, the standard Nazi insignia. But beneath it, another mark. A series of numbers and letters that did not correspond to any known Kriegsmarine designation. The team ran the code through every available database. Nothing. It was as if this section of the submarine existed outside the official chain of command. The decision was made to cut through. The torch burned for over an hour, carving a hole large enough for the ROV to slip through. When the camera entered the sealed compartment, the operator on the support ship actually gasped. The room was lined with medical equipment. There were steel gurneys bolted to the floor, intravenous stands, and cabinets filled with glass vials. Still intact. The labels faded but legible. Adrenaline, morphine, and something else, Pervitin, the Nazi brand name for methamphetamine. The drug that kept soldiers awake for days, that turned men into machines. But the quantities here were staggering, enough to dose a crew for months. Then the camera panned to the far wall, and that is when the true nightmare revealed itself. There were restraints, leather straps attached to a reinforced chair. The leather was cracked and stained, but the buckles were still tight. Someone had been strapped into that chair, recently enough that the material had not fully decomposed. Next to the chair sat a logbook. The ROV's mechanical arm carefully retrieved it, sealed it in a waterproof container, and brought it to the surface. When the researchers opened it in the lab, the pages were damp but readable. The handwriting was precise, clinical. It was a medical log, but not the kind you would find in a field hospital. This was an experiment log, and the subjects were not prisoners of war. They were the crew. The entry that changed everything. The logbook was written in German, dated from March to April 1945. The first entries were routine: crew health assessments, minor injuries, standard submarine medicine. But around March 20th, the tone shifted. The entries became technical, detached. The handwriting was the same, but the content was different. It was no longer about treating illness. It was about inducing it. The ship's doctor, a man identified only as Dr. Wilhelm K., began documenting a series of injections. The substance was referred to as Compound 7. The logs described it as a synthetic adrenaline derivative combined with an experimental stimulant designed to extend human endurance beyond natural limits. The goal was clear. They were trying to create a crew that did not need sleep, did not need rest, a crew that could operate the submarine indefinitely without rotation. The first test subject was a volunteer, a machinist's mate named Franz Becker. The log noted that Becker received an initial dose of 10 milligrams. Within 2 hours, his heart rate had doubled. He reported feeling invincible, alert, capable of any task. For the first 48 hours, the results were promising. Becker did not sleep. He worked continuously, performing maintenance tasks with precision and speed. But on the third day, the log noted a change. Subject is becoming agitated, refuses to eat, claims he can hear voices through the hull. By the fourth day, Becker had to be restrained. The leather straps in the medical bay were used for the first time. By the fifth day, he was dead. The cause of death was listed as catastrophic cardiac failure, but the notes suggested something worse. The doctor wrote that Becker's body had essentially burned itself out, metabolizing its own muscle tissue to fuel the hyperactive state induced by the drug. Most researchers would have stopped, but Dr. Wilhelm didn't. The log shows that he adjusted the dosage and selected another volunteer, then another. By April, half the crew had been dosed. The results varied, but the pattern was consistent. The drug worked for a short time, then it destroyed the body. Some men lasted a week. Others barely made it 3 days. The final entry in the log was dated April 28, 1945. It was written in a shaking hand, barely legible. The doctor noted that he had administered the compound to himself. He wrote that the Reich was lost, that the mission had failed, but that the data must survive. He instructed whoever found the log to deliver it to a contact in Argentina, a name that has since been redacted from the public records. The implication was staggering. This was not just a rogue experiment, this was sanctioned. Somewhere in the collapsing Nazi command structure, someone had greenlit a program to chemically enhance submarine crews, turning them into tireless operators who could slip through Allied blockades and deliver cargo, or people, to safe havens in South America. The submarine was not carrying gold or weapons. It was carrying test subjects. The cargo was the crew themselves, dosed and logged, turned into living experiments to see if the formula could be perfected for a post-war continuation of the Reich. But the horror did not end with the logbook. When the forensic team examined the remains recovered from the submarine, they discovered something the doctor had not prepared them for. The chemical traces in the bones suggested that Compound 7 was not just methamphetamine. It contained something else, something biological, and whatever it was had started to rewrite the crew's DNA, the thing they became. Modern forensic science is extraordinary. A single fragment of bone can tell you diet, disease, even emotional stress. When the remains recovered from the submarine were analyzed, the initial results were standard: malnourishment, stress fractures, signs of long-term confinement in tight quarters. But then the lab noticed anomalies. The bone density was wrong. In several of the skeletons, the long bones, the femurs, and the tibias showed unusual thickening. This was not natural growth. It was pathological, as if the body had been trying to reinforce itself against some massive internal strain. The marrow samples revealed elevated levels of a protein the lab had never seen in human remains from this era. It was similar to myostatin inhibitors, compounds that regulate muscle growth. In animals, blocking myostatin creates what we call double muscling, where the creature grows far beyond normal size, becoming grotesquely strong but metabolically unstable. The German researchers theorized that compound 7 was not just a stimulant, it was a gene modifier. In the 1940s, we did not have the language or the science to describe what we now call epigenetic activation, but that is what the evidence suggested. The drug was forcing the body to override its natural limits, pushing growth and energy production into overdrive. But the human body is not designed for that. It collapses. The skeletons showed signs of catastrophic organ failure, hearts enlarged to the point of rupture, livers calcified from trying to process the toxic overload. These men had not just died, they had been consumed from the inside out. Then the team found the photographs. Tucked into a sealed compartment near the captain's quarters were several images printed on heavy stock paper, waterlogged but recoverable. They showed the crew. These were not standard naval portraits. The men in the photos looked wrong. Their eyes were too wide, the pupils dilated to the point where the iris was barely visible. Their skin had a grayish pallor. Several of them had visible lesions on their faces and hands. One image, dated April 15, 1945, showed 3 crew members standing in the control room. They were smiling, but the smiles were too wide, too forced, the expression of men who had forgotten how to look human. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed Dr. Wilhelm K. himself, sitting at a small desk in the medical bay. He was writing in the logbook, but his hands were shaking so badly that the pen had torn through the paper. On the wall behind him, scratched into the metal with something sharp, was a message in German. Sie werden nicht schlafen lassen. They will not let us sleep. The implication was clear. By the end, the crew knew what had been done to them. They knew they had been turned into something else, and they knew they could not stop it. The submarine had been scuttled deliberately, not to hide cargo or evade capture, but to contain the evidence. The crew flooded the ballast tanks and took the boat down, sealing themselves inside as a warning. They were trying to bury the experiment. But the ocean does not always cooperate. And now, 80 years later, the truth was surfacing whether we were ready for it or not. The question that haunted the research team was not just what had been done to these men. It was whether the formula had survived. Because if the logbook made it to Argentina, if the data was preserved, then Compound 7 might still exist. And in an age where genetic enhancement and performance drugs are billion-dollar industries, the idea that a 1945 Nazi experiment could inform modern science was absolutely terrifying. But the story does not end at the bottom of the Baltic. When the team traced the supply chain for Compound 7, when they followed the paper trail back through occupied Europe, they found something that changed the context entirely. The submarine was not the first test, it was the last. The discovery of the U-boat forced a re-evaluation of other wartime mysteries. Researchers began looking at previously dismissed reports, stories of soldiers who displayed impossible endurance, of entire units that operated without sleep for weeks during the final push into Berlin. What had been written off as propaganda or exaggeration now had to be reconsidered. There were documented cases of SS troops in the defense of the Reich who fought with such ferocity and stamina that Allied commanders suspected them of being drugged. They were right, but it was not just Pervitin. It was early versions of Compound 7, tested on infantry before being refined for submarine crews. A 1944 memo from the Medical Corps, declassified only recently, referenced field trials of experimental stimulants on volunteer units on the Eastern Front. The results were described as promising but unstable. Several soldiers had to be terminated after experiencing psychotic breaks. The program was scaled back and moved to more controlled environments like submarines. The logic was brutal but efficient. A submarine crew is isolated and contained. If something goes wrong, the evidence sinks. You do not have to worry about witnesses or mass casualties in populated areas. The ocean becomes the incinerator. The archive trail led to a pharmaceutical company that had operated out of Bavaria. The company had been absorbed by a larger conglomerate after the war, and its records were scattered. But a persistent historian named Claudia Herrmann found a shipping manifest from March 1945. It showed a delivery of unmarked chemical compounds to a naval facility in Kiel, the same port where Richter's submarine had been photographed. The delivery was signed for by Dr. Wilhelm K. The compound was listed only by a batch number, but the quantity was enough to dose a crew of 45 men for 3 months. The submarine found in the Baltic had a standard crew of 44. Herrmann also found something else. A post-war intelligence report from Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited German scientists, surfaced. Several chemists who worked on stimulant research were brought to the United States. Their work was classified and folded into early experiments with amphetamines and performance enhancement for military pilots. The report noted that one chemist, whose name was redacted, had refused to cooperate unless granted full immunity. He claimed that his research had been misused, that the intended application was medical, not military. But he also admitted that the compound he developed could, in his words, unlock the limits of human biology if properly refined. The report ended with a note that the chemist's work was transferred to a private contractor and that further details were restricted under national security protocols. The implication was staggering. Compound 7 had not died with the submarine. It had been salvaged, studied, and potentially weaponized by the victors. The same Allied powers that condemned Nazi human experimentation had quietly absorbed the data and continued the work under different flags. The submarine was not just a German horror, it was a blueprint. Then came the final revelation. In 2023, a former archivist in Buenos Aires came forward with documents that had been hidden in a private collection. They were medical records from a clinic that operated in Argentina in the late 1940s, a clinic known to have treated fleeing Nazi officers. One file, marked only with the initials WK, detailed treatment for severe neurological damage and metabolic collapse. The patient had arrived in Argentina in late 1945, smuggled out of Europe on a rat line through Spain. He had survived for 3 more years before dying of what the records called total systemic failure. But before he died, he had given a series of interviews to a sympathetic doctor. Those interviews, recorded on degraded audio reels, were recently digitized. And in them, Dr. Wilhelm K. described the experiment in full. He described the selection of the crew, the escalating doses, the descent into madness, and he described the final order. He had been told that if the mission failed, he was to scuttle the submarine with the crew inside. No survivors, no evidence, just data. The revelation that Wilhelm had escaped, that he had lived long enough to document the experiment in detail, meant that somewhere in the world there might be a complete record, a formula, a methodology. And if that record still exists, then the question is not whether Compound 7 could be recreated. The question is whether it already has been. The silence from government agencies regarding the Baltic discovery has been deafening. The site has been declared a war grave and is off limits to further exploration. The logbook and the photographs have been archived under restricted access. Official statements describe the find as a tragic example of the desperation of the final days of World War II, nothing more. But the researchers who were there, who saw the restraints and read the logs, know better. They know they did not just find a submarine. They found proof that the Nazis were willing to sacrifice their own people in pursuit of an inhuman advantage. And they found evidence that the experiment did not end in 1945. It just went underground. So here is the question that should keep you awake. If a government was willing to turn its own sailors into chemical test subjects in a desperate bid to win a lost war, what would they be willing to do in peacetime with refined versions of that same technology? And if Compound 7, or something like it, is sitting in a lab somewhere right now, waiting for the right crisis to justify its use, would we even know? Or would we just see soldiers, athletes, workers who never sleep, never stop, never question, and think it was just the next step in human performance? The submarine in the Baltic did not just carry bodies, it carried a warning, and we have chosen to ignore it. Let us know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the formula still exists? And if it does, who do you think has it? Do not forget to like and subscribe for more buried truths. Thanks for watching.